Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. So we have 5 members present. As soon as we get one more, we'll dive in. Actually, no, there we go. Desiree, can you go ahead? Oh, I guess I'll call the meeting to order. Municipality Bankers Assembly Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee. The whole agenda today is November 19th, 2020. It's 11 o'clock. Now, Desiree, would you call the roll?
Yes. Ms. Allard. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy. Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Presverdia. Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera. Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
All right, that presents quorum. And on the agenda today, we have a presentation from AWWU on rate design, water and wastewater utility rate design, fire protection charge, and cost of service study. And then down below, we'll have a brief update on the stormwater utility. Mr. Corsentino, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Or can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone's gotten the presentation. If not, hopefully you can see it on the screen. So as Chris alluded to, what we're going to talk about today, and by the way, just for the record, this is Mark Corsentino, General Manager of AWWU. I've also got online with us the team that's developed this. I've got Grant Utrenka, who's our CFO, Heather Ralfko, who's in our Reg Affairs group, and then I've also brought in our regulatory attorney, Mike McLaughlin. I think he's here along with Sean Korn, who's also worked with us to develop the rate studies, which we'll kind of go over today. Okay, so moving along, we're going to talk about proposed rate changes. First and foremost, what we're going to talk about is just a resummary of the across-the-board rate increases that will go into effect next year. Then we'll go into general rate setting methodology. or rate studies. This is important because it'll lead into the rate studies that we did for both our water and sewer utilities, and it'll mimic what you will see later in a stormwater utility rate study. So it's appropriate to show this with a different few different perceptive in mind. Then we will go over the results from a water cost of service study, which includes the proposed fire charge changes. And then we'll go over the preliminary results for the sewer utility cost of service study and elaborate on a few things why we may want to delay that specific one, as odd as it may be. Okay, so Tuesday night, the Assembly approved our operating budget, which included the across-the-board rate increase of 4.8% for the combined utilities, which is the 2% water and 8% sewer rate increase. We're delaying that until after the first quarter because of COVID, and we've also asked for less than what our revenue requirement study calculated, again, because of the COVID issue. And we've cut costs and to do what we can because we understand there's a pandemic and we have less revenue coming in. There's a lot of reasons we did that. But that was approved by Assembly Tuesday, but there's one other step in order to take it to the RCA. Per code, the Assembly also has to approve our submission of those proposed tariff changes, which are the rate changes to the RCA for the rate increase we're proposing for next year. That was introduced also on Tuesday night, but it goes for public comment and approval at the next Assembly meeting on the 8th. And that's one of those things that must pass in order for us to get that done in a timely manner to file with the RCA before the end of the year, which is an important feature. As a quick summary, we've seen these already. You've all seen these already. That's about the 2 and 8% for about less than $4 a month increase on sewer and about $1 increase on water. Again, going into effect not until April 1st. Septic haulers will see a modest increase. But the biggest reason I put this on here is looking at the fire service charge. Because there's an across the board 2% rate increase. The annual fire charge, the water utilities charges the MOA through AFD, it went from 5.2 to about $5.3 million. But you're going to keep those numbers in mind because that will, when we get into the cost of service study for the water, you want to remember those numbers, and I'll reference back to them if we can. But just remember that in 2021, the fire service charge on an annual basis will be about 5.3 million, minus the first 4 months won't be charged at that rate. But if you looked at it from a fully annualized basis for comparison reasons. Okay, generally speaking, rate studies, there's a methodology, and the purpose of a rate study is to provide sufficient revenue to operate and maintain, in our case, our water and wastewater infrastructure. Rate studies are important for all utilities, regulated or not. They're just different criteria for the different types of utilities. They're intended to reflect prudent financial planning criteria, meaning that utilities, specifically economically regulated ones, have to be sustainable. And we borrow, particularly in water and sewer, across the United States and the world, as a matter of fact, water and sewer utilities are capital intensive. You know, you have a lot of assets, a lot of them are buried and out of sight and out of mind, and they're expensive to maintain. So we borrow a lot of money, but we also have to have equity contributions as well. And what it gets to is those 3 bullets below. We have lending, because we borrow a lot of money, and we're actually going to be refinancing a lot of our old debt to save us money in the future. We have to have good ratings from our lending agencies and good, so meaning our financial metrics have to be met. And there's actually covenants on some of our bonding covenants as well. So making sure we're good financially whole and stable is very, very important. So that's part of a rate study, is making sure you can have your financial metrics in good working order so you can be eligible for borrowing. You also want to meet rate structures and goals and objectives. And some of those may be water conservation or some measures like that to see if they can be worked into rates. For instance, the stormwater utility, one of them is looking at green infrastructure as credits for green infrastructure. That kind of stuff are goals and objectives that can be put into rates, but they have to be equitable, cost-based, and legally defensible. So that's ultimately what a rate study does. There are generally accepted standards, particularly in water and wastewater, for rate studies, manuals from both AWWU and Water Environment Foundation. These are the ones the RCA has allowed us to use for these rate studies. And I don't know, a little sneak peek, I think we'll probably end up using this wastewater one for the stormwater one as well, but that's a future discussion we'll get into actually pretty quickly here. There are 3 major steps in a rate study. First is the revenue requirement, then a cost of service, and then ultimately the overall rate design or tweaking of it. At a high level, you have to have sufficient revenue to cover your expenses, plus have a modest investment so you can reinvest in your infrastructure for the existing ratepayers. Costs have to be equitable and allocated to the cost causers, cost payers. And then you want to make sure you're doing final tweaks to make sure it's the right rates for your region. So a little more detail of that. Revenue requirements, which is a study we do on an annual basis whenever we have a rate increase. You compare your revenues to your expenses to determine the adequacy of rates. What this means is if your revenues, if your expenses haven't increased and your revenues haven't changed, you may not seek a rate increase that year. So you don't even need to do a revenue. You may do the initial part of a revenue requirement, say, guess what? We don't need to do a rate increase. Let's not even bother with this. So you may not need a rate adjustment at all. That's a good thing, but that's oftentimes not the case. So if you do have to have a rate adjustment, you need to do a full-blown revenue requirement study, which is something we did do, which is why we're proposing the rate increases we are next year. They're over a specific time, and they're going to be a one-year period. That's just the way they work for locally. And they have to be the most recent audited financial statements, which is another challenge. So there's all this regulatory lag stuff. Your rates we're going to be paying in 2021 are based on 2019 financials, plus other known and measurable costs that we'll know at this time. They're standalone basis, meaning that they're unique. They don't depend on any MOA or city funds. They're entirely rate supported, by the ratepayers. And then there's, you're using generally accepted methodologies, which is the utility basis approach. When you get in the cost of service, that's a little different beast. They're revenue neutral. They make sure that those revenue requirements, the revenues that you need, are allocated. Those costs are allocated appropriately to the customers that are causing them. Again, make sure they're fair and equitable. They're avoiding subsidies, and the revenues are tracking the costs. Again, cost causer, cost payer mindset. And if they fixing subsidies if they exist, and average unit cost. Now the trick is on these, and this is why they're unique. They're not done on a regular basis. The revenue requirement's done whenever you do a rate increase. So a lot of times it'll be done on an annual basis or at least every other year, depending on what you need. Cost of service, they reflect overall rate allocation changes. So the last one we did was in 2004. And as a matter of fact, that one wasn't even accepted because it also tied to the fire service charges. So they're not done on a regular basis because they're expensive and they're very complex. And so nevertheless, but they're appropriate. They need to be done. And actually, as a matter of fact, the RCA mandates they be timely to some degree, and they are done from time to time. In this case, what we're going to find out is the RCA didn't mandate we did a cost of service or a rate change study. The Assembly did because of the fire service charge and the water. And when you do water, we do sewer as well. So that's kind of a unique perspective in this go around, but it was timely because our last one was, we're looking at 16 years since we've done one the last. And then the final step of a rate design is, well, by its name, the rate design itself. It's the final tweaking to make sure you're essentially meeting the goals and objectives of the city. In this case, is the fire service charge, is there something unique in your area that may warrant a different kind of tweak or that's just justifiable? Whether it's the fact our fire service area and our water service area are different, so it warrants another look, or you're trying to promote water conservation. Those are things that are finally looked at as the tweaking, the final stage in the rate studies. So we did two cost of service studies, one for the water utility and one for the sewer utility. We did water first, just because that was the major driver that the Assembly pushed for a couple of years ago when the issue first came up. But at a high level for both water and sewer, the cost of service studies will, if they're accepted by this body and then submitted to the RCA and also accepted, they will reallocate costs to make sure they'll reallocate costs to more metered usage versus fixed usage charges. In other words, what we've seen is that, which you'll see in the next few slides, that metered customers use more water, so they're going to get a higher percentage of those costs associated with that. And it also incorporates the fire service cost. It will align cost causer, cost payer for all customers. Again, it's more updated than it was back in 2004. Things have changed. In unintentional consequences, will probably promote conservation by shifting costs from fixed customers to variable rates. But it also, the twist of that, just like electrical utilities have seen, is it could provide a revenue deficiency for the utility if current consumption trends persist. What happened this last year with COVID is our overall water demand didn't change at all from last year. As a matter, we average about 20 million gallons of water production and demand in the Anchorage Bowl. When the businesses were all shut down, the commercial use this year, because people weren't using water in their business and whatnot, using it at their house. Well, because we're fixing water, but we were not getting the metered usage, and that's one of the challenges. If metered customers use less water because their rates are higher, you can actually have a deficiency. So that has to get reconciled. On the water utility, the fire protection changes will better align cost causer to cost payer. It will result in tax exempt organizations paying a portion of fire protection, which they're not now because it's fully tax funded. And then but it will also result in a larger water bill for ratepayers. The final thing on the cost of service there, we also did the sewer one. You'll see later and why. We're promoting not submitting this one right away with the water cost of service, actually delaying this by a year to two, and I'll elaborate that later. But there's a risk the RCA could reject that. So going back to the water cost of service specifically, what we did is we looked at the fire protection charges, water customer rates. We reallocated those rates based on the updated usage patterns and actually the updated capital investments, meaning from 2004 to this date, we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in reinvesting in our assets. And a lot of it was in redundancy and our water transmission and distribution as opposed to water treatment, which saved our bacon during the earthquake. You know, the redundancy and resiliency in our network, our water distribution network, kept everyone in water during the earthquake. Even though we had a lot of water main breaks, we were able to keep everyone in water. We had, almost $10 million, some of it even somewhat catastrophic, but we had enough infrastructure in place to keep people safely in water. And that's because we've invested wisely over the last decade. But that also shifted some of those costs from certain to others. And the important thing on this, that the take-home message here is, assuming we're good with the water cost of service study, it is time sensitive. We need to submit an AO by the end of this year and file it with the RCA, because sadly the one downside of the RCA, the economically regulated rate kick studies, is you have to use the most recent financial statements, which don't become available until this year. They became available like June or July of this year, and you have to file them by the end of the year. So you have to do 6 figures of work between the time you get your audited financials till the end of the year so you can file it timely and appropriately. So it is time sensitive. So specifically on the water cost of service impacts, the rate changes, if you will, what you want to look at on these two tables, the far right columns, the 2019 test year, where it's labeled as 2019 test year RRS revenue requirement study, that is the rate that you approved through our budget last year, the 2% and 8% water increases. So in 2021, water customers on single family will pay $55.62 a month in sewer or on water, and then triplexes and duplexes, these are the rates they'll pay next year. Now what happened is with the cost of service, you reallocate those costs appropriately. And again, and one thing to keep in mind, even if we approve the water cost of service study, these rate changes, they will not go into effect until sometime in 2022. I'll go into that later, but that's the regulatory lag process. Anyway, so the rates would go from $55.62 for a single family residential customer up to $58. And part of that, there's 2 reasons for that. While their customer account dropped, meaning what happened is we had a shift in cost from admin type stuff to more of our infrastructure maintenance costs. We invested a lot more in infrastructure, so that pushed the cost from customer charge accounts to the usage accounts. The usage is where you get the infrastructure promotes the usage. I mean, that's because you're using water, you have to have the infrastructure to support it. Hence, this usage charge went up. Customer went down, but we also added the fire charge, so the combined rate is an increase of about 6% from the rates they'll see next year. Likewise, that's mimicked in other places as well. Now, the trick is the biggest rate allocation change is that our commercial customers are going to see a fairly large rate increase for 2 reasons. A, just kind of what we said earlier, cost causer, cost payer. They're using more water, taking more benefit, so their usage rate goes up. Their meter account actually and the customer account still go down because, again, that's the shift in cost, but their cost, because we've invested in the water transmission and distribution to meet their needs, has gone up. And they also are taking in the fire service charge, their portion of the fire service charge. So their overall rates will go up with this cost of service study by, the 12% range. So some customers like a duplex will actually see a huge reduction in rates, because what we found is that duplexes, the unmetered duplexes by our test meters, we do have a few test meters on these to verify this. They're not using much water. They don't have lawns to mow necessarily in the summertime. They're just using a lot less water. So, but again, it gets back into reallocating costs to the cost causer, cost payer principle. Now, on these fire service charges, where do these come from? So let's go to that next, because that was the huge justification for doing this and its holistic reason. As we said earlier, remember I think of the second slide or third slide, I said, remember that number of 5.2 million, 5.3 million. In 2021, if it was fully annualized, which is not, the fire department's rate would be $5.3 million. If you do the cost of service analysis and continue with the same process of the MO, that entire would go to about $5.9 million, this number right here. But what we said is the fire service charge made up of two components, direct charges and indirect charges, which we went through in the last meeting on October 15th. So we split those up and said, okay, what seems fair, justifiable, and reasonable is that the fire should pay for the hydrants, those direct hydrant charges, because those benefit of the water utility. There's more of a benefit to the fire department there than the utility itself. And then, but the upsizing should be split. And so what that does is it takes the total upsizing charge, which is the cost of those infrastructure, upsizing, water tanks, pipes, all that kind of stuff, gets split. About $4 million gets split between AFD and the AWWU ratepayer. So in other words, you're putting another one. You're taking, now the positive side is it changes the fire charge from the number of 5.3 next year down to 4.3. So it's reduced by $1 million, but the total cost is a $1.5 million shift to the AWWU ratepayers. So where does that cost get split up? This $1.5 million shown here going to the AWWU ratepayers. Here's who will be paying that on an annual basis. Single family residences will pick up about $750,000, which is why their rate went up from 52 to I think 58. And with all our customers, that's about 3/4 of that. Then the rest of it's shown here on this table. And the annual ratepayer impact for just the fire charge is this outlined right here from an individual perspective. So this is where the shift goes to. Okay, so that's the water side. And because we do the water cost of service study, we also need to do a sewer cost of service study. They are by and large done together. They need to be, it's expected. However, as you're going to see, we're going to recommend, well, we did the preliminary cost of service results, which will show, and they likewise reallocated based on updated sewer waste strength patterns and capital investment patterns that we have done over the last decade since 2004. But we ran into a little bit of a snafu in that JBER has a special contract that we need to renegotiate that wasn't clear. What's interesting is there's a strange long history there. The contract with JBER is made up of two former entities, Elmendorf and Fort Rich. Fort Rich's contract we renegotiated and made it tariff rates some time ago. Elmendorf, that never occurred. There was always struggles with doing that. And so we need to do that. Now, they don't have to do it though, and they may argue and fight that. So it's going to take some time, we expect. And the reason why we haven't really pushed it for, they have a special contract rate, but as it turns out, it was they pay the lesser of the two special contractor tariff rates. And in the past, anyway, our tariff rate was less, so they just ended up paying the tariff rate by default. That has changed. Our tariff rate is now more than their special contract rate, which means the ASU, anchored sewer utility customers, will be subsidizing the Elmendorf portion of JBER if we don't fix that, and that will take some time, and so we need to reconcile that. All right, but getting back to the cost of sewer preliminary results, again, the 2019 test year on this table shows what customers are going to be paying next year with their rates. Single family residential will go up to about $52 a month. And then some of the metered costs. Septic haulers will go up to $28 per 1,000 gallons. That was on the second slide or third slide where we showed the rates for next year based on 2019 test year financials. With the cost of service, what we've done is, because again, we spent a lot of money in this case in our treatment plants. So instead of where that cost comes in is the strength of your wastewater is really important because we have to treat it. So in total suspended solids is the primary treatment method we use at Asplin. So that's a huge component of where those costs get shifted to. So what we saw is, as a matter of fact, in a single family residential waste, it was down lower. So they actually get a benefit. They're going to spend a little less money. However, that gets shifted again back to the commercial customers because their waste strength is higher. And so they're going to be paying more with the cost of service. Again, it's a reallocation of cost to the cost causer, cost payer principle. And septic will take a pretty big increase because they have really high strength wastewater, and it takes more to treat that. So that's a summary of the sewer side. But here's the snafu we ran into, what I elaborated on earlier. In 2019, they're going to, like all customers, they're going to see across the board rate increase. and their rate's they'll pay about $1.7 million based on how much water they use, sewer we treat for them. If you do the cost of service study to reallocate the rates, because again, they actually have fairly high strength wastewater as well, and we've made investments at the plant to treat that. They should be paying $3 million based on the 2019 test year and the cost of service analysis results, the rate study. What'll happen is while they should be paying, now go to the next table down, while they should pay $3 million, they have this special rate that says they pay the lesser of tariff or their contract rate. In this case, their contract rate only says they need to pay 2 of the 3. So there's about $1 million shortfall. And that's a problem because that one or two things can happen. The RCA can say, AWWU, eat that comes out of your net income, and that hurts all our financial metrics and puts the utility in damage from a sustainable perspective down the road. Or they make the other ratepayers subsidize that. So now the trick is the RCA only has so much say in that. Really, we've got to negotiate that at the federal level with JABER, and we've just run into this. It's going to take some time, so hence we are recommending delaying this sewer cost of service study. I think what I've said here, all this stuff is true. In addition, as a matter of fact, there's one other reason we want to delay it too. That was one reason. The other reason is we are going to make some substantial changes to our septic receiving stations. We've worked with the borough and their septic haulers, and they understanding of what we're doing, but we need to make sure that we're doing some improvements to make sure we're doing the right thing with our septic stations for a lot of different reasons. One of them being making sure our waste streams are correctly quantified and avoid some hiccups we've had at those facilities. And accepting the fact that there's a kind of a shift and change of the borough is going to build their own septic stations. They're not going to do that. We'll accept it, but we're going to make sure that those costs that we bear at those stations are correctly allocated to them. Because even with this large cost increase in the septic stations, the rate increases, they'll still be way less than the borough or anywhere else can do that. We are very, very low on our rates on our septic haulers by orders of magnitude less than places in the low 48. So we're very competitive on those rates, but we do need to make some improvements for permitting reasons, among others. So we're going to do that, but we want to capture those costs because, like I said earlier, cost of service studies, rate studies, if you will, they're very expensive, they're very time consuming, they're not regularly done. And so we want to catch this cost in there so it's fairly allocated correctly. So they're not subsidizing the septic hauler customers. So the next steps, we're meeting with our board December 2nd to get their buy-off and approval on these cost of service studies, both of them. But particularly in the water one, we need to introduce this water cost of service study if there's buy-off on it from the assembly at the next meeting in December, because we need to get the introduction, and then for an ordinance, we need to get the introduction and the final approval prior to the end of the year so we can submit it to the RCA. If we don't do that, there's a little trick. You can remember how I said the RCA requires the most recent financial statements, recent audited financial statements, which are 2019 statements, which didn't become available till June or July of this year. But they have to be filed by the end of this year as well, so they need to be timely. You can ask for a waiver, but they don't give you much time. I think if you're in your packet, I think if you look at this number, oops, let me go back one. I think what you saw, I think originally we had March 31st of 2021. That's if we ask for a waiver. That's maybe as far as we can get it, and the RCA may accept it. But we're putting this in the RCA's hands as opposed to yours. So we'd like to file this by at the end of the year, so they are forced to take it and review it as opposed to saying maybe we will, maybe we won't. If we miss filing this at the end of this year or getting a waiver to file this year, you're going to wait 2 more years before we can do a cost of service study again, because they will not. A cost of service study actually has to have somewhat of a normal year as well. If we have 2020 financial statements available next summer, and we could try to do a cost of service study next year based on the most updated financial statements, they're going to say 2020 is not a normal year, which it is not. Our consumption patterns for water, we talked about earlier, very abnormal because businesses were not open. So it will not be an acceptable test year, which means we'll have to wait for 2021, which puts us in a, you see the whole domino effect. So this is time sensitive to get this done. And then the RCA takes their long, long time to do everything. You can read through it yourself there. So I think I've talked enough, and I will open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you, and I would note that Ms. Allard has come, and Mr. Gates is in the queue. Please, Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted just to ask about the waiver usually in the statute regulation, there's a stated standard to obtain a waiver. Do you know what the language is for evaluating whether a waiver should be granted or not?
I cannot answer that, but Mike McLaughlin, our regulatory attorney, Mark, are you here? Can you answer that question?
Yeah, there's for this, there's not a particular standard. I think I've seen waivers of this kind in the past, but usually they're only granted if it's soon after the turn of the year. If effectively, the longer that it gets out, the less willing the RCA is going to be willing to give us a waiver, simply because the information becomes more and more stale. And where that March 31 comes from, is my estimate of the, about as far as you can go without, while still having a decent chance of getting the waiver.
Thank you.
So does anyone else have questions for Mr. Costantino? I'm not seeing any questions. Mark, what kind of guidance are you looking for?
Okay, great question. Two, we need to move on the water cost of service study. In other words, if there is willingness, we'll submit that at the next an ordinance to approve the to allow the assembly to authorize us to submit those tariff changes, rate changes, to the RCA by the end of this year, or at the bare minimum, like what Mike had said, very soon after the first of the year. It'd be better to do it at the December meeting, but at least you'll have. We'd like to put it in front of you, and that's simple as that. So if you have any thoughts or opinions on that, let us know, because that is our plan as of now. And the sewer one, it's a little bit more in your court. I'm recommending we delay that one. It's kind of odd. The RCA may think that's kind of strange, and they may push back, as would you. I think I'd like us to resolve this J-Bear issue, but we could still submit it as is, and leave J-Bear out of the cost of service study. But it just seems unfair and unequitable to some degree, but it doesn't prohibit you from saying do it anyway. Because it may actually provide a better chance of success. The fact we're doing, the RCA likes to see both the water and sewer utilities submit these cost of service studies together, because there is an interrelation. But this little hiccup is a one I'm going to recommend we delay it. So I'm not going to offer to submit a sewer cost of service study unless I hear from the administration or the assembly that they'd like to see that submitted with the water cost of sewer service study. So that's kind of input I'm looking for. Okay,
and one question that I have relating to the cost of service is the question of, with that $1.5 million that you identified that would be pulled off of the ratepayer, or excuse me, off of the taxpayer and onto the ratepayer. Can we get will of the savings for those individuals who are outside of the service area, who are paying, so that we can show the differential for people, that fairness issue?
Can you elaborate? In other words, they're going to see a $1.5 million savings. So I don't know how many. That's probably something I'd have to ask the assessor's office, and and I don't know if they're here. In other words, how many properties are in the outside the AWWU service area that are in the fire service area? But what I can tell you is their annual savings from those properties will be $1.5 million. So if it's 10,000 properties divided, it's not something I can do alone. I can tell you the magnitude of the number, which is $1.5 million. Right. But I don't know enough about how property assessments works. That's something we'd have to get from the assessor's office.
And would that show up in the cost study, or is that something we would have to look for outside of the bounds of that?
It would be outside the bounds of that.
So Mr. Slipka said he'll be asking the assessor, because I think that's a really important number for folks to grasp, because it's not just a rate increase, it's an actual balancing of fairness. So we also have two more people in the queue. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Costantino, if we were to delay, or if we were to go ahead and go forward with water and sewer and then come back and address the J-Bear question, what's the, how soon thereafter could it be addressed? And is there any way, I'm not as familiar with the RCA as you are, that if the JBER question can be resolved shortly thereafter, even if the others are submitted, is there any consolidation option in the RCA to just wrap that in at that time?
Yeah, good question. I'll answer the first one. I'm gonna have Mike McLaughlin answer the second component. The first component was how soon they're at. One thing I gotta think. Give me a minute here to digest that information. I had a response and I lost it. Mike, why don't you go ahead and take a stab at answering what you think you can on that question while I recollect my thoughts here.
Sure. Yeah, basically, I think first of all, I think that the process is likely to take at least months at the just based on our experience in negotiating other things with JBER and even any kind of changes to the contract that we've done in the past. It takes a long time to get them, first to get their attention, and then to get them, even if they do agree, to actually go through the process of making changes. So I think we would be well into, even though we're starting now, I think we're going to be well into next year before we have any kind of resolution. And by that time, we'll be, if we file the sewer cost of service study now, we would be so far down the road on the regulatory process. I think it would be pretty much impossible to bring that in, to try and do a, total revamp. We'd effectively be doing a new cost of service study, which would be difficult.
Well, and thank you. Now I've remembered what I was going to say. Great question, and thank you, Mike, for stepping up. One of the reasons why I'm reluctant to a cost of service study right away is what Mike may have not alluded to some degree is that the RCA will likely make us do another one in the few years anyway to capture these change in costs. And one of the things about the cost of service studies, I think I said earlier, but I don't remember, is they are very expensive and time consuming. They're in the six figures just to do them for the studies, and then you add in all the RCA fees and times and legal fees, it gets really very expensive, and that's a cost the ratepayers pay for. So hence we don't like to do them very regularly because they are very expensive and the ratepayers pay for them. They need to be done because they do reallocate and make the cost equitable, but doing two within 2 to 3 years would be very abnormal and extremely expensive and unfair to the ratepayers in my mind. So hence, I'd prefer to delay it so we don't have to do 2 sewer cost of service studies within 3 to 5 years. That would be kind of, in my mind, a challenge for our ratepayers to pay for.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a quick follow-up?
Please.
Thanks. I appreciate that, but if you go before the RCA without the sewer cost of service study, there's also a chance they may just send you back to go do one. And then would that necessarily, or would it create a significant delay on the water side, which I know is time sensitive?
Well, but that's at least in their court. They in some respects, the RCA can do whatever they want. They could do that, but that's why I'm recommending we delay the sewer cost of service study. Now, they may wrap it in. They could say, like you said, bring it in anyway, the sewer side. The RCA could ask for that, and we'd submit it as is because it's done. It's preliminary anyway. But what will happen is they'll note that there's a discrepancy with the JBER contract, and my concern is they may say, AWWU, you eat that $1 million cost, or you force JBER to fix that, but JBER may not fix it for a year with us, if they do at all, right? They have no... There are some terms in the contract that allow us to shut their sewer off, but that's a little abrupt and harsh. Hence why I think we'll get there. It's just going to take some time, which is, I think, what we're asking for on the sewer side. But yeah, there is some risk with the RCA in that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Weddleton, please.
Can you hear me?
Are muted, Mr. Weddleton. Yeah, now I can.
Okay, sorry. I'm playing around with the new laptop and I'm learning as we go. So I had a couple questions, and one, I think I must have missed part of the story, and I apologize. Because we had introduced increases in rates at a previous meeting, so those are for action, I presume, at December 8th.
Correct. Yep.
So the cost of service study, is this for the next round? I mean, you must have done a cost of service study that led to those rates, and the one we're talking about now is a new one?
Okay, did you, good question, John. So you may have missed, I don't know if you missed the first couple slides where we kind of did a pseudo lecture, so I apologize. You're right. At the assembly meeting on Tuesday, you approved our budget, which in effect approved our rates for next year. But that was based on a revenue requirement study, which does not look at reallocating rates. And that was,
How are you?
and then
Still healthy.
Mark,
still
hold on one
alive.
sec. Could you
Yes.
please mute whomever's unmuted there?
So what do you do down there when you're?
Okay, thank you. So John, we did the revenue requirement study, which is something I think I showed. We do that on a yearly basis. Anytime we need a rate increase, we have to do a revenue requirement study. That just makes sure you have sufficient funds to ask for if you need them. The cost of service is really and the rate design are really unique, and they're the ones that aren't done on a regular basis. It just happens to be we're driven by the assembly to look at our rate design for water, which we need to do water and sewer together typically, although I'm obviously asking for that to be changed slightly by this group. But that's where that came into play. In other words, revenue requirements always done. You absolutely nailed it. We are asking for a rate increase across the board for water and sewer customers because of our revenue requirement issues. It just happens to be we picked the same test year, the 2019 test year, to do the new cost of service study. They're on somewhat different schedules, though. Remember, revenue requirements, the rate increase that we're proposing next year is interim and refundable. The RCA will take 450 days plus on both those studies, but they'll make the revenue requirement, the rate increases interim and refundable effective when we ask for it, which is April 1st of next year. The cost of service, those are not interim refundable, but they go into effect immediately upon final approval if they do, which will be sometime in 2022, mid 2022. So those changes in the fire service charge we won't see for a few years if we submit them now. If we delay submitting them now, particularly on the water side, and have to wait for a new test year, which they won't allow 2020 because it's not an anomalous year. We'll have to wait for a 2021 test year, which that data won't become available until mid 2022, which puts us into like 2024 before we see changes. There's a whole regulatory lag process in regulatory rates. I don't know if that answered your question or made it muddier, but that's my stab at it. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, that was great. I had not had a distinction between the revenue and the cost of service study in my head, so I think that's a difference. Okay, and you mentioned your board is going to meet to approve something. Is that the cost of service study process you're proposing?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, we have a lot of different hands in the cookie jar when we have oversight on this body here, and we have our board, the assembly, and the RCA, all of which need to approve our processes to some degree. And so, yes, the board needs to buy off on our tariff changes as well. And that will happen, we presume, on our board meeting is December 2nd. We introduced this to them November 2nd. We just didn't have we had a quorum, but we didn't have everyone there, so we wanted to wait until we have more people there. They were fine with it, generally speaking, but they just wanted more of the members there as opposed to just barely having a quorum.
Okay, I see it's December 2nd. I wanted to make sure that was before we would look at those rates anyway. So, Chris, can I ask two more?
You have the floor.
Okay. So when will septic haulers get notice of their of a rate increase?
Yeah, great question. Actually, as a matter of fact, after the assembly, assuming and after the assembly approves our rate increases, the December 8th meeting, we'll put out a public notice. Now, here's the other thing. Remember, they're interim refundable, so they'll also have, as soon as we submit it to the RCA, then, because we need to wait for that approval by the assembly, then the RCA, as you see this, I think it's right here, whether it's a cost of service or a revenue requirement, these processes are about the same. There's going to be a 30-day public comment period in front of the RCA for our rates, which they tend to go to a lot, as a matter of fact. And then again, it's a 450-day process anyway, so there's also probably other times that they can weigh in on that. But we'll also send out a notice. We don't send out a notice on our proposed rate increases until they're approved by the assembly. That's just a historical practice because whatever we submit could change, and we state that even in the notice. So we've got one prep to send out, just haven't done it yet because we're waiting for the December 8th approval.
Okay, that notification plan makes sense from your point of view, but it frustrates the haulers who feel like they're blindsided. But I don't recommend you change your.
Understand.
And they can come to our public hearing and then also to RCA. So
that's right. They're
not cut out. So one last thing is you can pull out of the RCA process now. Is that correct?
A lot of lawyers have different opinions, but yes, I think the door has been open to some degree. But I'm not. The administration would have to drive that, or the assembly, and you're more than welcome to do so. At this point in time, I've got enough on my plate that I'm not going to push that. Yeah, it can't. There is a process though, and the RC could challenge it. So that's the summary. So it's not as easy as a flip of a switch. There is a process that likely will get challenged if you want to go that route, and there's reasons to and not to do that. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank
You guys
you.
don't flip switches, you turn valves.
So Mr. Slivka has a report back on the question I asked. Want to go ahead, Alex?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I misread that.
Saying that I heard the question and I am asking the question.
I'm sorry.
There was a bit, the assessor is asking for clarification. So he can tell you how 1.5 million translates into a tax reduction. It would be equal. I guess what you would want Mark to tell you is what does that $1.5 million increase look like on the average ratepayer, and then you could take that differential to figure out how the people outside the AWWU area would be impacted.
Exactly. And then hopefully that can be one of in the whereas clauses of whatever ordinance comes forward, just so we can communicate clearly that kind of fairness piece. Okay, I'm sorry, I misread. I didn't have my glasses on. I thought you said you had the answer back. Okay, any other question? I don't hear any, so let's move on to just a brief update on the stormwater utility.
Yeah, as you remember, one of the things that, thank you for the support in doing that. The commission, the Stormwater Utility Commission did a good job too. The one thing that I think hopefully communicated well is that once it's approved by the assembly, one of the things we do need to go back and do because of the COVID issue is, I wouldn't say the cost is not going to change and the scope of work isn't going to change, but there's going to be some retweaking of the contract to make sure we address in advance the COVID impacts. And so they're in the midst of doing that. We're nearing completion. It's in final contract. Contract was done and negotiated. It's still being tweaked out slowly. In the interim, there's a couple things. We're working on getting a Stormwater Utility Policy Commission, which is one of the tasks in that study. So you have policy leaders from DOT, the MOA, the various policy stakeholders that I was saying this, and also the commission itself has some changes that they're going to recommend to the assembly to make in the Stormwater Utility Commission. But at a high level, we're moving on it, but it is kind of caught in purchasing and contract renegotiations. Again, the dollar value is not going to change, the scope's not going to change, with the exception of whether it's public, mostly public involvement and travel and that kind of stuff. We want to make sure we're getting a fair, it's fair for both sides of the spectrum. So it is moving. We've got a project manager on it. We've met with the commission. So there's work going on. We're just not quite there yet, but it is being moved on. I hope that gives you information.
I was just waiting for Ms. LaFrance to type in and ask a question. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that update, Mark. And one question has to do with the composition of the Stormwater Utility Commission.
Yep.
And how many members do we have who've been confirmed? And also the second part of that question is on those changes that the commission is going to recommend to the assembly, does that also include a recommendation concerning the size of the commission as well? Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, great question. I don't know if Jason's on too, but the first question, the answer is there was 10 confirmed members out of the 11. But the commission themselves recognized that's a strange, or maybe it was 10 members. You know what? I had the answer. We've been one shy of the final confirmed members, but as a matter of fact, we had one member who needed to step down for health reasons. But the commission themselves have said we think there's a better number, whether it's, I think it's 9 they want, and they're going to recommend that. And then I think there's still one outstanding member. Jason had a member, I think, from the commercial sector in the arts area that needed to be confirmed. I'm not sure where that's at, but that'll replace one of the members that's stepping down. So by and large, I know that's a confusing answer, and I apologize for that. Yes, there will be changes from the commission to recommend reducing one of the members from whether it's 10 or 11 down to 10 or 9. And then we need to fill one of the vacant positions because there's a member stepping down.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Chair, a follow-up, if I may?
Yes, please.
When does the commission meet next? And do you envision that they're going to be meeting monthly or more than once a month at this point? Thanks.
Good question. Let me get back to you on that. I don't know that. I think I don't know that monthly will be appropriate until we get full and earnest. But I think once we start getting information together, it could very. But let me find out the answers to those questions. Their next meeting, I think, is already scheduled. It would be on the boards and commissions website, but let me double check that and I'll get back to you.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, is there anything else from the members? I think we've already adopted the budget for the year and don't know if we want to discuss any legislative priorities.
Chris, I do have one other question for you, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
We also have this same topic we just went over today, scheduled for a meeting tomorrow afternoon with the Assembly. The other question I guess I'd have is, do we need to meet tomorrow afternoon? I think at 1 o'clock there's a meeting scheduled for this exact same topic.
Is that a work session?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have an email drafted to you, Mark, to ask if we actually need to have that work session. So I guess I can just ask you now, do we need to have that work session?
If everyone's satisfied with the information they've seen today, my answer would be no, but that's I'll leave that up to you.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. My leaning is that we don't need the work session, but if there are other members who think we do, I will wait and hear from them.
Okay.
So I have some unnamed person in the chat. I can't see who made the comment. It says question on priorities.
Hi, Mr. Chair, that's me, Suzanne.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Prince.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you if I'm assuming that the Port of Alaska remains on the legislative priority list.
Yes. I don't think that's changed. I don't know if Mr. Bockenstead is on the line here, but or Mr. Slipka, your hand is up, so maybe you want to take on both if you have information.
Yes, so we actually discussed that this morning, and yes, it does remain on the legislative priorities list. And I actually had two small items related to the port, if you have a minute. So the first is that we are in the process today of issuing $65 million in bonds to help finance the 2021 work, and it's going very well. And then the second piece is a heads up that you're going to be getting a change order request for about $1 million relative to our contract with our designer of record. And it's pretty self-evident. This contract was done in 2017. The work that we're asking for wasn't included in the original contract because funding for construction of the 2021 phase was uncertain at the time. And this $1 million is already included in a lot of the modeling that we have been done. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that this is going to be showing up on your agenda sometime soon.
And that's Jacobs?
Not Jacobs. This is for Cowie Northwest. They're the designer of North America, Cowie North America. They're a designer. And Jacobs is the project and manager.
Okay, and what's the scale of that? You said $1 million relative to the
total. This will take the total value of this contract to $9.5 million.
So less than 8% or something, or maybe 12%. Sorry. Okay, thank you. And I'm not good at off the cuff math, but not a huge sum. We're not talking 50%.
Right. I just wanted to make you aware because I know change orders raise a lot of questions, and so just wanted to give you a heads up that this is pretty straightforward and the explanation is in the material.
So we often have questions about change orders come from one member who doesn't appear to be here. So you might want to just brief that member.
I will do that.
Thank you. Anything else for the good of the order? I don't see anyone else's hands. If that's the case, audience participation is next on the agenda.
Hello? Hello?
Mr. Haberman, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, respectfully. You can call Haberman. Just a note, listening to me most of it, but I want to just alert you. The meeting that you got next, the Budget and Finance Committee, if you go on the website for public notices, it's showing the meeting starts at 12:10 a.m. and ends at 12:10 a.m. For 11:19. So but if you go somewhere else, you'll see the right notice. But the main notices for that meeting that's coming up shortly is in error. And I wish you all the best and take care. Bye. Hello?
hello?
Yeah, I finished.
All right, thank you. And if anyone else, does anyone else want to be heard? Opportunity to speak is now. Last chance to get off mute if you're muted. Hearing nobody, I guess I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you, everybody. We'll be back shortly. Another meeting.
Thanks.